So I have no plan how this is going to go, and it'd be the most unscripted thing generally ever. But I thought the three of us had a nice chat on Twitter, and it would be interesting just to extend it in person, because I'm sure we all have a bunch of questions. But just, I guess, for anyone who's not listening, who's listening and knows who any of us are, Jonathan, do you want to start by giving us, I guess, just a brief bio and your background just for context, and then maybe you do the same, Sarah?
Sounds good.
Sure, yes. So I worked as a high school psychology teacher for quite a number of years. The past 5 years I've been working for University of Strathclyde. So I teach a lot of stuff to do with the psychology of education, basically. And alongside that part-time, I was doing a PhD, which focused on spacing and interleaving. So interleaving and kind of metacognition are kind of two of my main areas of interest, really.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'm Sarah Cottingham, and I work as a teacher educator for Ambition Institute, and I've just finished a master's in educational neuroscience, and I caught a Centre for Educational Neuroscience talk that Jonathan did a couple of weeks ago that was absolutely fascinating on interleaving and the research, and I tweeted out a thread which I hope didn't say anything wrong. and then from that we've sort of had a bit of a discussion, and that's where we are now to kind of pick up on that discussion.
Amazing. And yeah, in case anyone doesn't know, my name is Brad, psychologist and director at InnerDrive. The reason I was really keen for this is we do lots of CPD around memory and spacing and a bit on interleaving. And I think interleaving is definitely the area of cognitive science that is either the most challenging to implement or people have the most questions about. Yeah, Jonathan, especially based on, I guess, your talk and your report that I've read, which I'll put a link to somewhere because I think it's amazing. Just hope it was okay to ask you a whole bunch of questions, really, if that's all right.
Sure. Yeah, no, I'd agree. It's a sort of area where there's potential for confusion.
Amazing. So, yeah, I guess the first part is to clarify the difference between what spacing and interleaving is before we kind of get into some of the challenges around it. You're probably best placed to kind of give us the 1 minute overview, the brief difference or definitions between the two, if that's all right, Jonathan, and I guess take it from there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, as I see it, I guess they are both things that have an impact on learning and memory. One of the areas of confusion, I think, comes from the fact that some of the early interleaving research called it spacing. And that was partly because the researchers at the time, this is maybe like kind of 12 years ago or so, they assumed that interleaving was helpful because it led to spacing. They assumed it was just kind of essentially the same thing. And then some research tried essentially separating the two out, and they found that not only was interleaving beneficial on its own without spacing, but actually spacing sometimes interferes with interleaving. Because really interleaving is all about putting two somewhat contrasting but related things side by side. And if you then space those things out, then that's unhelpful because you can't see the contrast anymore. But spacing is still helpful if you can see the contrast and then you have a delay and then you see another example of a similar contrast maybe the next day or something like that. So they have a relationship, but they're not the same thing.
So would it be fair to, obviously an oversimplification, but broad brush, spacing is revisiting the same material regularly over time, whereas interleaving is more the contrasting of two, or I guess potentially sometimes more, but at least two different things side by side from one another.
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. Yeah, certainly. And I would sort of see interleaving as often more about kind of learning a conceptual idea and understanding where the boundaries of a concept lie, whereas spacing could be repeating really anything, but just if you repeat it after a delay, after a bit of forgetting has kicked in.
And I guess part of the confusion, I guess, comes is, in my mind, by definition, some interleaving has an element of spacing, because if you're doing one thing and then a different thing as part of the contrast, by definition, you're not doing the same thing twice. So when you then go back to that first thing, there's been some element of revisiting it. So it has elements or shades of spacing. Would that be fair to say? Or would that be a bit of a misconception, Jonathan?
Yeah, no, I think that's true. So often the contrast that's done in experiments is you have maybe several different categories of things, and you either have multiple examples from the same category, that's blocking, or you have multiple examples from different categories, that's interleaving. So I sometimes use the examples for like shuffling a deck of cards. So, you know, those cards, like the diamonds or whatever, are going to be further apart from each other. So there is some spacing. There's going to be a few seconds between one example and the next of the same category, for example. So yeah, as I say, I think that's why the researchers initially thought, well, this is just spacing. That's why it's helpful.
So it has an element of spacing, but it's distinct from it because of the main focus is the contrast. That's what I got from your thread, Sarah. Is that kind of fair to say that was your interpretation?
That was my takeaway. And Jonathan's just said something which kind of has been a bit of a light bulb moment for me just this then. So I just want to check that I'm not wrong. You just said there earlier, Jonathan, that it's like about you space the contrast. So is it that the main spacing or the main spacing effect that you get from interleaving is that you've put like a and little a together and they've seen the difference, and then they've got the meaning they've made out of that is the contrast that they've kind of got, and then later it's like not for a while that a and little a contrast is shown again, and so you've spaced the actual contrast. It's not necessarily, or it is partly the spacing of big A and big A, but mainly it's spacing the contrast. Or if I just misunderstood that?
Yeah, no, that's right. And your summary thread was great, by the way. I thought you got it spot on. And I should also give some credit to researcher Monica Birnbaum, who did some research on this. And the first one that I really kind of saw to kind of manipulate spacing and interleaving separately in a really systematic way. And some of it, and I believe it was her own PhD that was about 10 years ago that you know some of this research came from. But yeah, so the contrast could still be there, but you could have so for example, yeah, so if you're contrasting category 1, category 2, so that learners understand the difference between them, then it would be, you could have, you know, example from category 1, example from category 2, or maybe example from category 3 as well, then a gap, and then a further 3 examples from those 3 categories. That would actually be helpful. That would, because you would have interleaving and you would have spacing. But if you have 3 examples from category 1 and then a delay, and then 3 examples from category 2, and then a delay, and then 3 examples from category 3. You've still got spacing, but you've lost the interleaving. And that's often, I think, what happens in schools, essentially, because you have topic 1 on Monday and topic 2 on Tuesday or whatever, and we kind of lose some of those important contrasts.
But just to go on that, on a practical level, so I appreciate you lose some of the interleaving benefit from what you just described there, but you said you still have the spacing benefit. So, and because spacing is so powerful, we know how quickly students forget things, and quicker than they probably realize. Even if you lose the interleaving benefit from what you were describing, there's still, my understanding from what you just said and the research is, there'd still be a learning gain overall. Maybe not as much as we'd like, but it's not a bad thing, because you're still utilizing all the spacing research in theory. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, depending on how you do it, potentially you could still be benefiting from the spacing effect. It's a bit, I suppose, like, you know, perhaps an easier example for people to think about is something like spacing and retrieval practice, how you can combine those 2 things together. So you could combine spacing and retrieval practice by having spacing in between, like, retrieval questions, quizzes, or whatever. Or you could just tell them the stuff and space it out. Well, kind of better to have both benefits rather than just one. So, you know, you could space out more passive learning, or you could space out more active retrieval learning. So, yeah, I think the other aspect of that, I think, is that actually, although you can retain things better with spaced practice, it's still actually quite hard to retain stuff if you don't conceptually understand it. And over the longer term, they probably will forget a lot of that stuff, maybe beyond the test or the exam or whatever. So part of the benefit of interleaving really is actually conceptually understanding where, like on a sort of schema level, where one concept ends and how it's distinguished from another concept, with quite often subtly different things. So if you imagine in English, for example, if you want to understand like genres in English or genres in writing, then often like seeing them side by side is going to be much clearer for learners. You know, just spacing out examples of a particular genre is not kind of giving that same learning experience, I don't think.
No, that makes sense. One question I was dying to ask you, and I'm mindful of time, so I've got to get it in early. When I was reading your spacing and interleaving guide, which I'll keep saying, I think is the best thing I've ever read on this. I'll just say it forever. One thing that made me think, in the sense of my own advice, what I've seen being played out, is I think if you Google interleaving the curriculum, you will get a ton of hits. And I know there's a big focus in a lot of schools, a big challenge is, how do we tap into this cognitive science area and how do we interleave the curriculum? And then in your report, and not to like quote you back and put you right on the spot, but you said you thought it really interleaving needs to happen in a single lesson or a study period, so you can do that side-by-side contrast. Does that mean you think you can't interleave the curriculum? And even as a concept, it doesn't make sense almost, because interleaving isn't done on this macro scale. It's more about this contrast of two different ideas, so that helps discriminate and differentiate the ideas and therefore solidify the learning. So yeah, I guess my long-winded question there is, can we interleave the curriculum, or is that just like, is that the wrong focus with this sort of stuff, do you think?
Yeah, I guess maybe you guys could tell me exactly what that interleaving in the curriculum would look like. I think it's actually quite valuable to think about, on a practical level, what are we actually doing? Because, whether something's evidence-based or not really depends on how you do it a lot of the time. So, but yeah, I think that essentially the interleaving, the evidence on learning new concepts through interleaving at least is about very small, very brief examples being contrasted within quite a short space of time. So if it comes to something like, let's say, for example, when I was teaching courses to senior pupils in secondary school, and we would have maybe 5 topics in the course, there's not necessarily going to be that much benefit from trying to sort of shuffle together those topics, within the same few weeks. Compared to maybe doing topic 1, topic 2, topic 3. I mean, there could be, because it may be that you're sort of touching back on things where there are relevant contrasts, and you're like, yeah, we talked about this, and then you maybe get an opportunity to do that interleaving within one lesson. But I think just doing that by itself is not necessarily going to have that much of a benefit. And in some ways, the school timetable is kind of interleaved already. I don't know, maybe Sarah, maybe you have a suggestion of how that might look, what that might look like.
No, this was my burning question as well, and this is what I took from your talk, which was like, I didn't quite realize like that the research was all about this the sort of proximity that you're talking about, and how like that was really important. And I just like, it doesn't seem like you can achieve that from one lesson on a Monday to like a different topic on a Wednesday, unless, like you say, Jonathan, you're like bringing up what happened on the Monday and contrasting it within the lesson. But I think it sounds as if just mapping out stuff at a macro level, that, like, as Bradley's described, without like understanding that it is about this proximity, could potentially be a lethal mutation of the research on interleaving.
So with regards to that proximity, that's I just had a thought. So I've always worked on the assumption that with spacing, in terms of proximity, you revisit it just before people forget it, and that prompts them to think harder. So for spacing, you kind of want to, in my mind, stretch out just before they've kind of forgotten it. Whereas it sounds like you almost want to do the opposite with interleaving. The proximity is actually, you want them as close together so that you can highlight the contrast. Does that sound about right then? I guess the spacing, the proximity is longer potentially, whereas interleaving, the proximity should be tighter.
Yeah, but I guess it's about what is proximate to what. You have it's still probably fair to call it a desirable difficulty like spacing. As you say, spacing benefits from being left until we kind of almost feel uncomfortable with how long it's been, because you're actually going to get more benefit from the review. With interleaving, sometimes learners may find it a little bit confusing to look at contrasting examples. They probably find it a lot easier to do lots of examples of the same thing. I mean, I should say this is, I'm kind of mainly focusing on learning of new concepts. There's also a whole bunch of interleaving research that's more about practicing, like interleaving practice problems and things like maths, which I think is great. But quite often you're not necessarily doing the initial learning via interleaving. You're maybe interleaving contrasting problems, so they're better at recognizing problems out of context and that kind of thing. But again, the key thing is really for those like individual problems, individual tasks, individuals examples, that those are, that different items are side by side. And yeah, as you say, sort of trying to apply it maybe whole scale to the entire school curriculum, or for a head of department to say, right, okay, do this lesson then and do this lesson then. That's probably too large a, the granularity of it's not really there in terms of the specific things that would need to be contrasted.
I have to admit, I've never thought about doing it side by side, or essentially having both different things right there to really highlight the differences. And when I read that in your report, it seemed like, you read sometimes stuff and you go like, that sounds so obvious. And yeah, I've never thought of that up until now. You kind of need someone to point it out. I generally thought that was a really clear guidance of what it might look like actually in action. You mentioned maths there. And I know a lot of the research, not all the research is done in maths. I think my favorite interleaving study was the one where they had to throw different weighted bean bags, like 5K, 10K, and 15K. And then when you then come back to throw a 10K one, those who interleaved it did it better. So I know it's not just on maths. I understand why researchers like maths. It's really kind of easier to quantify. One of the things that I sometimes get some pushback from teachers is this doesn't apply to my subject as much. And the one that I hear the most is history. Because history I always get told, and I'm not a history teacher, so I always kind of defer to the experts, the history teachers themselves. But a lot of them will tell me, I teach it chronologically, and you kind of have to understand what caused World War II, you have to understand what happened in the 10 or 15 years beforehand, and so forth. But I get the impression from your report, Jonathan, you thought that any subject you can interleave in. So do you think some subjects are naturally, it's easier, or do you think some subjects actually you just can't do this interleaving, or do you think it's a universal guidance?
Yeah, I mean, I think that often when it comes to these sort of cognitive processes, that the basics are actually quite similar. I mean, I think it probably is worth looking at things like you mentioned the beanbag study. It probably is worth looking at a physical skill as potentially as being different from factual knowledge, just because they do involve quite different processes. But and actually interleaving seems to be beneficial for like visual stuff and physical skills as well. Yeah, when it comes to history, that's an interesting one. Just a little kind of example. I was observing a student teacher's lesson earlier this week, and they were talking about JFK and the assassination of JFK, and they kind of threw in the example of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. I thought that's actually quite a good example of kind of contrast within a letter. It's similar but different. And I think that actually, although we may teach history largely chronologically, probably what a lot of experienced teachers do is they kind of touch back on things and they kind of make contrasts, and they not just contrasts but also similarities. You don't just want to know where things are different, you also want to know where things can be usefully grouped together. So I think it's maybe the idea of compare and contrast is actually quite an old idea in education, and it's something that probably teachers are doing to some degree. But I think that sometimes our desire for things to be quite neat and tidy and organized and planned actually kind of goes against interleaving, because life is naturally quite messy. Children learn stuff through very kind of like chaotic play and that kind of stuff. So, a lot of things do get contrasted, and we do have sort of interleaving does happen naturally, I guess, in everyday life. Being too rigid about it is not always going to be helpful, I think.
Amazing. So I'm mindful that I'm just hogging all of Jonathan's time.
No, I don't want
to put you on the spot, but I'm aware of timings as well. Is there anything that you wanted from your own experience, or to ask Jonathan based on your reading of stuff?
I think you've covered the questions that I wanted to answer, but I'm just gonna summarize what I've taken away, Jonathan, and then I want you to sort of treat it like a check for understanding and tell me if there's anything I've misunderstood. So, like, for me, from what you have both said, it kind of comes down to like, why would you use interleaving, and therefore when would you use it? It doesn't sound like it's a good unto itself and we should just be interleaving everything in life. But the why would you use it? You'd use it if you've got things that are like different but similar, and you want to understand the boundary of the particular concept, and therefore like putting them side by side, pointing out similarities and differences, or getting them to kind of learn that by induction is potentially useful. You could also use it in practice, to practice like applying different strategies to similar looking questions and having to discriminate what the question's asking you. And then that sort of answers the sort of the when would you use it, but it seems like it's more on that micro scale because it is about that contrast, not necessarily on that macro scale that Bradley said. Jonathan, hit me with anything if I've misunderstood any of that.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think you've summarized that really well. Yeah, I think the first thing you said there, Sarah, about that it's not necessarily just a good in itself, that we, I think to me that's quite important. It's quite important to a lot of evidence-based practice, a lot of kind of cognitive science and learning. I don't think we should just be saying, just do this all the time. I think there's really a beneficial, it's really beneficial for educators to at least have some understanding of why this is helpful, because then we can make professional decisions about when to use it and when not to use it, how much to use it, who to use it with, those kind of things. Even spacing, you probably want to have at least some understanding, like you said earlier, Brad, about, it's like space until the point where they might be about to forget it. So, well, you kind of need to understand how forgetting works then to make a good judgment of when that's likely to happen. So I think, yeah, professional knowledge of when it's going to be useful and when it's not going to be useful. Yeah, and I think I'd agree, yes, that idea of contrasting, the idea of maybe subtle similarities or subtle differences. So, like in my, just sort of in my background, you might have something like neurons, like you might sort of contrast motor neurons with sensory neurons or something like that. Well, that's quite useful because then learners are going to sort of say, oh, well, yeah, I see these are slightly different from each other. But if I saw them in 3 weeks apart, I might not have noticed some of those differences. But there's also cases where we might feel that there are subtle similarities. So, going back to history, there might be something like a revolution. We learn that something's a revolution. This is the French Revolution, this is the Russian Revolution, but it's not inherently a revolution. It's a revolution because people have taken things that have subtle similarities and categorized them that way at some point. And sometimes actually things that look quite different because they're in a different time period and they involve totally different people, very different events, actually saying, well, these have subtle similarities, there could be an argument for that as well. So I think, all of this is really about kind of developing conceptual understanding, sort of recognizing meaningful contrasts and meaningful similarities in what we're learning. And yeah, again, sort of going back to your question, Brad, I think that does apply to pretty much every kind of factual learning, every subject.
So I'm aware that we are pretty much out of time. I have a million more questions, but we don't have time for them. But what I was dying to ask you is how much interleaving is too much interleaving? So we talked about like two things side by side. I was once told and under the impression that one of the benefits of interleaving is it prompts you to think harder about the strategy and the thought process, like the step-by-step of how to answer a problem, because if you encounter different types, if you interleave the types of problems. So is that does interleaving lead to that benefit of thinking hard about the strategy and the process, as well as just to the actual differences within the content? And the last thing I was going to ask you was about, if you were going to say like kind of traps to avoid or common misconceptions or like misapplication that you sometimes see in the classroom, what would that look like? But I feel like those are too bigger questions to squeeze into the last 2 minutes. So hopefully we can do this in like a month or 2 months time, and I can basically just refer back to this clip so I can remember what my burning questions were, because I might even have more. So if you're keen, I'd love to pick it up again at some time. That'd be really helpful.
Sure. I mean, if I could just say something very briefly about that question, which possibly kind of touches on both of the things you just asked about, which is that one thing that we could do is, as educators, to vary the difficulty, is think about how many categories we're using. So you could interleave like 5 different categories, 10 different categories. Some research studies interleaved 18 different categories. If you reduce the number of categories, you're only interleaving 2 things. That's going to modify the difficulty. So, if you're finding that learners are just finding it too hard, then that's one way we could potentially manage that, because we don't want learners being stressed. We don't want them feeling confused. If you're doing a particular kind of maths problem, then introducing a whole different kind of maths problem could feel pretty confusing for them. So, I think that it is important for educators to use their judgment to modify the difficulty, not to go too deep into it. But I think that you can possibly, as learners gain more confidence, then you could bring in further contrasting examples and that makes sense. Forward.
With that being said, Sarah, I think your blogs and threads are pretty much worthwhile of being on Twitter alone. So if anyone is watching this and wants to follow you or find out more, can you let people know where they can find you?
Yeah, I have a silly Twitter handle. I'm at overpracticed, and I blog at www.overpracticed.com. So yeah, feel free to read stuff there.
And Jonathan, yours, as I said for the 15th millionth time, your Spacing and Interleaving guide was awesome, and I think it should be a must-read by all in education. Where can people download it, find out about you, or even get in touch if they want to ask more questions?
Yeah, sure. So I wish I'd thought of something as catchy as practiced, but my Twitter handle's just at JW_Firth, and also jonathanfirth.co.uk is my kind of personal website, and that has a lot of downloads, blog posts, a lot of it on this kind of stuff.
Amazing. From my perspective, I appreciate you both giving up the time. I could ask questions all day about this stuff, so I appreciate it. And hopefully we get to do it again soon.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Thanks both of you.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Right.